Okay, in this video, we're going to review the concept of just what is code and what is scripting in particular. Okay, so what is programming? So when we say that when we're writing a code or we're writing a program, the way to think about it is we're writing a set of instructions on telling how a computer needs to perform a certain task, right? And we want to do this because computers are much, much faster at processing data and performing computations. And so we write code to instruct them how to do that, right? So you can almost think of code as like the language that we use to communicate with computers. And so I think the part that I think people get confused or intimidated by is that you have to be very explicit and very methodical in how you write code, right? It's not like it's not like human communication. And so when you communicate with other humans and you tell them to do something, there's a lot of things that are implicitly kind of assumed, implicitly understood by humans because we're humans. But for computers, they have to be told kind of exactly what to do. And so often what I tell my students is that, you have to think of them as like very powerful babies, very powerful toddlers, right? They can simulate crazy things, but they have to be told exactly how to do things because they don't know any better. Okay, so some typical ways that we use computer programs as engineers are, first of all, it provides a great tool to process and visualize data. Oftentimes when you run an experiment, you produce a lot of data from it, and so you need a computer to help you process all of it and visualize it. Another way is to run computational modeling or simulations. Um, and so if you want to predict how something's going to go, then you can solve the governing equations using MATLAB. That's very common. Or number three, if you're working on a design project, you can use programming to optimize the design parameters, and that's very common as well. Okay, so how do we actually do this? And so the simplest way I think to write MATLAB code, or basically to tell a computer to do something, is to just input it directly into the terminal. And so MATLAB has this thing called the terminal, where if you open up MATLAB, you'll see this thing called a command window, and you can input commands in there, and MATLAB will execute them in real time, right? And so in this way, you can almost think of it as like a really fancy graphing calculator that can do a bunch of stuff, right? And so doing code in this way is great for quick calculations, but I wouldn't exactly call it programming in the traditional sense because the commands are kind of executed in real time and they're not really saved to a file. And so the more traditional way to write code is to save them into a text file, which often we call the code file or the script file, kind of in everyday speak, right? And so what you do is you typically write all the code into a text file, and then you tell the computer to run it, and then it'll then execute all those commands, okay? And the reason we like this is that the code, which can be anywhere from a few lines of code to hundreds or thousands of lines, it's saved to the computer so that you can kind of run it and edit it later. MATLAB is a little bit more free in how you write the commands, so you can actually write multiple commands in one line. But when you're first starting out, I always tell people to just write one command per line, just to make it easier to see. Okay. And the nice thing about using MATLAB text editor is that it'll automatically highlight keywords, and so that helps you in writing a program. And always remember that when you write code or MATLAB code, your MATLAB will read your code from top to bottom and executing each command kind of one at a time in the sequence that is read. Okay, and so let's talk about the anatomy of a MATLAB script, of what it'll typically look like. And so I'll say that not all programs look like this, but I would say this is kind of more of a typical program that you would write as an engineer. Okay, and so I think having this kind of general structure, I think, kind of breaks down some of the intimidation that a lot of people feel for writing code, right? And so typically when you write a code, the first section will be dedicated to just loading data or defining data. The next section is when you're going to perform all the computations in MATLAB, and the last section is when you usually visualize your results, right? And so as an example, let's say that you just ran an experiment you want to measure gravity, right? The acceleration due to gravity. And so you ran some experiments, you dropped some marbles, and you timed how long it took, the marbles to hit the ground, and you did this, several hundred times, okay? And so in the first part here, you would probably load that data, and so you probably have that data stored as some kind of spreadsheet, okay? And then in the second part, you would actually perform the computations. And so based on the amount of time it took the marbles to hit the ground, you can then use the equations of kinematics to determine what the acceleration due to gravity is in that sense. Okay? And then once you have those results, you can then plot them. And so you can then visualize things, what's the average acceleration due to gravity, what's the standard deviation, what are the errors in the experiments. That's what you can kind of visualize in that last section. Okay. And so this kind of illustrates a typical kind of workflow of a code, but these are going to change kind of case to case as well. But generally speaking, if you're kind of writing code for the first time, this is, I think, kind of a good format to follow.